Our last speaker on the agenda is Peter Ridge, who was a consulting agronomist in the 80s and the early 90s, who later moved to Queensland and became involved with work on seasonal forecasting applications. Last year, Peter spoke on the relationship between weather, climate cycles and the forecasting of wheat prices, which got everyone buzzing when we all walked out the door. So we've invited Peter back to see how right he was last year. And without further ado, I'll hand it over. Good on you. Thanks, Peter. Did you want to speak?
No, I'll do this. Yeah, thanks, Evan. And what I thought I'd do today in the last session is to build on some of the things I talked about last year, perhaps reinforce some of that, but also to bring to bear some new information and some new analyses that I've done. And I hope that you'll find that of interest and value. But I think the best place to start is just with a map of sea surface temperature contrast. Now, when you look at a map like this, and the address for this site that gives you this map is in the paper, so you can always go and have a look at it yourself. I find it the most powerful way of getting a handle on what's going on and what you might be looking at in the way of weather over the next 6 months or so. But that's the picture that I showed a year ago at this venue, and you can see quite clearly to the north of Australia, right around the northern coast, from the northwest right over to the Coral Sea, we certainly had plenty of warm water. So on that basis I was fairly optimistic about the way the season would shape up from this time forward. The sad thing is it didn't know how to stop. When I showed that map last year, or that image last year, I also explained that the SOI, Southern Oscillation Index, is really a reflection of the contrast across the Pacific Ocean, between the Coral Sea on our side and towards South America. The SOI is actually a measure based on atmospheric pressure differences between Tahiti and Darwin, so it's an indirect measure, but it's reflecting that difference from one side to the other of the Pacific Ocean. The PDO, or Pacific Decadal Oscillation, is a northern Pacific phenomenon, and just remember that again it's a contrast between over on the northwest towards Japan and back towards Mexico, I guess. Now these are a bit of a simplification, and this is how I think about it, and I think it's probably a useful way for you to think about it. And then the Indian Ocean Dipole, which has also got a fair bit of press, particularly in the Weekly Times over the years, is this contrast across the Indian Ocean just south of the equator. So they're the main ones that I've talked about last year, and that was the picture we were looking at last year, and on the basis of that I was fairly optimistic about the remainder of the season. Let's go forward to this year, and you can see that sure the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is still showing plenty of warm water over here relative to back over here, so it's still negative. Negative's good for PDO. But more importantly, to the north of Australia, you can certainly see that there's far less warm water than there was a year ago. So that makes you a bit more doubtful about the way this season's shaping up. Fortunately though, for July, the SOI has come back from about +2 in June, back up to about it's looking more like +7 at the moment. So that's a good sign. We've still got plenty of warm water in the Coral Sea, but there is this emerging body of water over towards South America. So when you look at these images, I think you can start to get a feel, and you can go and look on these images, and you can go back, they come up every 3 days, I think, with a new one, roughly, every 3 or 4 days. So you can look at those images and compare what's happening today with what the situation looked like a year ago, or in fact, you can go on and look at a drought year like 2006, again in mid-July, when you can see quite clearly that waters to the northwest of Australia in that year were very, very cold at this time of the year. And so your reason for optimism starts to diminish. So that's just giving you a visual idea, and certainly feel free to get onto that site pretty regularly and just see what's happening. What I'd have to say is that, that very positive outlook that we had a year ago, that persisted, that sea surface temperature pattern to the north of Australia when it was quite warm, that persisted all the way through into January, unfortunately. So the indicators, just to summarise them: sea surface temperature for the SOI, it's a measure of sea surface temperature across the equatorial Pacific, and it's obviously favourable. What we're looking for is warm water near Australia, which usually means cold water goes somewhere else. So we're favourable for rain when the warm water is to the north of Australia into the Coral Sea. It's only got a short-term cycle, 18, 24 months typically, so it comes and goes pretty quickly. Whereas the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is in the northern Pacific, has got a longer-term cycle to it, about 50 years. So that's pretty important. There's a group at the University of Newcastle, Stuart Frank's group and some of his students over the last 7 or 8, 10 years probably now, have demonstrated this PDO cycle has been going on over 400 or 500 years at least. And they've done that looking at tree ring data and established that it's been part of the system for a long period of time. And currently we're entering into the favourable part of that cycle, which is the good news. And we've been in the unfavourable part, as you'll be well aware, for a fair while. And the Indian Ocean Dipole, Japanese group, have mostly been involved with developing this as a concept. We've seen plenty of IOD events that are positive in the last 10 years, 15 years, and very few negative ones. And what we're looking for is negative events for the IOD to be favourable to us. So there have been 12 positive unfavourable events since 1980 and no negative favourable events other than 2010. Well, certainly I'm declaring it as a favourable one. The new one that I've been working on the last 12 months is the southern annular mode. Now I've been aware of the concept for a while. It's harder to explain. You can't put it on a Mercator's projection like I did with the sea surface temperature contrasts. But if you can imagine looking up from under the Earth with Antarctica in the middle here, and you're looking at the low pressure system circulating around Antarctica. Now obviously what we'd like to have happen is for some of those to spin out and affect our weather in southern Australia. It also has effects on South America, the south part of South America, New Zealand, Tasmania, and it's one that I haven't spent much time on, but that's really, it can be quite important to us. And when the SAM is positive, southern annular mode is positive, those low pressure systems are tightly bound around the Antarctic in the bottom of the Earth, and when it's negative you tend to see it spinning out more vigorous cold southwesterly fronts that affect our weather. It appears to exhibit a long-term cycle as well, a bit like the PDO, and I don't think that's been given much recognition in the literature or in fact in the public domain. But it does seem to have a cycle, but it doesn't seem to be quite as regular as the one that I've talked about with the PDO. And like the PDO, when it's in its positive phase, it's not good news for us. So that's just going back to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And what I'm saying is, back in the 1920s, starting about 1928, right the way through here it was positive, back to about 1950, and that's the period of time when we had quite a lot of dry years. And then it went into its favourable phase through the 50s,